Hello, and welcome back to my series of tutorials on how to create mods for the Binding of Isaac, Repentance. If you haven't seen the previous episode where we make our first mod without Lua, you can view it by clicking the button in the top right corner, or by following the playlist in the description. In this video, we'll be going over how to create a simple passive item that gives you a damage up when collected. We'll be using a bit of Lua for this, which is the coding language that Isaac mods are programmed in. Let me preface this with saying that it's okay to constantly look at examples or references. Coding is really hard, especially when starting out, but if you jump right in completely unprepared, you're going to learn very slowly and likely learn bad practices that'll hurt you in the long run. If you have never learned a coding language before or are completely unfamiliar with Lua, please pause this video and go do a quick course in Lua or really any language. There are plenty of resources online, especially on YouTube, and every language uses the same principles. Once you learn one, you've basically learned all the others. Learning how to code is not only useful for making mods, but also opens up a lot of different opportunities as everything is digital these days. Anyway, let's move onward. Before we get started with coding, we must first install a good text editor. Text editors such as Notepad do not have the robust features that will make modding a smooth experience. Downloading a text editor designed for programming is practically necessary. The text editor we'll be using today is Visual Studio Code, or VS Code for short. You can use a different one such as Atom or Notepad++, but one of the plugins we'll be using is only available for Visual Studio Code. This plugin isn't required, but it greatly simplifies everything by giving us IntelliSense, syntax highlighting, and various other tools for coding Isaac mods. First, let's download the aforementioned VS Code. It's the first result on Google, just click download, it's also in the description. When you're downloading Visual Studio Code, make sure that you're downloading the one with a blue logo. There's also a similarly named software called Visual Studio, just by itself, with a purple icon. That is not what you're looking for. It's a very heavy-handed software, and you really only need Visual Studio Code for making mods. Alright, once you've downloaded Visual Studio Code, open it up, and you should see the Getting Started screen. I'll be explaining the various elements of VS Code as I go on, but to start, click Open Folder, and navigate to your mod. For this video, we're going to be using a fresh mod called My Mod, just as the last one. Remember that with every tutorial, you can follow a GitHub link in the description to download the mod. So if you need to cross-reference anything, but you don't want to watch the video again, just download the mod and you can find everything there. Alright, on the left, you'll see a few buttons. I may have more than you because of some of the plugins I have installed, but the three buttons that you will have and you should become acquainted with are the Explorer, the Search button, and the Extensions button. I have a bunch of extensions here, and extensions are pretty much plugins or add-ons to Visual Studio Code that just enhance the software. We're going to be installing two extensions today. The first extension is simply named Lua, and it's by the user SomeNeco. Just click on it, and there should be a button right about here that says Install. I've already installed it. This plugin will watch for certain common mistakes in our code, such as incorrect spelling or syntax, and it'll tell us about it. If you don't know what I mean by syntax, you can just think of syntax as the way a programming language is structured and written. When I talk about incorrect syntax, I'm talking about when you write your code in the incorrect way, which prevents the machine from understanding your code. Once you've installed that, search Binding of Isaac, and the first result you should see, or one of the first results, will be Binding of Isaac Lua API by Philoax. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. This plugin adds autocomplete and explanations for the modding API. This is a forewarning. It has been known to sometimes malfunction and isn't updated very often, but it's open source and anyone can contribute on GitHub. If you have the time and skills, please consider helping out, as this is a very useful extension. Before I get into everything else, I will mention that your Visual Studio will visually look a lot different than mine. I have installed a theme on my Visual Studio that just changes how things look. Everything should stay in the same place, but the highlighting and the colors of everything are switched up a bit. It's important to note that these plugins are not strictly necessary. You can code without them, but having these plugins make modding significantly easier. Alright, we have the tools we need to start coding in Lua, but first we should actually create our item. Lua is what lets us add functionality to our item, but before that we need to use XML. XML is not a coding language, it is what's known as a markup language. A markup language is essentially a structure used to format files. XML is a structure that Isaac uses to store information about items. XML's syntax is similar to HTML in that it uses tags, which are basically containers for information. You can assign attributes to those containers, and more containers within those containers. This is admittedly a lot of information to take in, so don't feel frustrated if you're confused. It likely will become simpler to understand once I actually start writing and you can see what's happening. One last thing though, it is unrealistic to expect yourself to remember the names and functionality of every single thing the Isaac API has to offer. So you'll need to reference the documentation often. Isaac has official documentation, but it's auto-generated and doesn't have any examples, so instead we'll be using the community-created documentation instead. It has lots of information about everything Isaac's API has to offer. It's updated very frequently, and any modding changes introduced by the new updates is usually documented within a few days, sometimes within a day. Now, on to making our item with XML. All XML-related content in our mod will go into a folder called Content. This folder is like the Resources folder, except that it'll add to files instead of overwriting them. This folder is almost exclusively used for XML files. Let's create our folder named Content. In Content, create a new file named items.xml. We're going to mimic how the items.xml file found in resources-dlc3 is set up. So let's open it up. To open it up with Visual Studio Code, just go to your folder and click it. You may also be able to double-click it and it'll automatically open up in Visual Studio Code, but I think that's a setting you have to set yourself. If you remember from earlier, XML is based on tags. So to start, let's make a tag that will contain all the items in our mod. Tags are defined with arrow brackets, so make an open arrow bracket and a closed arrow bracket. For this file, it must be named items. We'll create an attribute called gfxroot and an attribute called version. To create an attribute, first put its name. Then put an equal sign and 2 quotation marks. The value of the attribute will be inside these 2 quotation marks. The gfxroot attribute defines where all sprites for the items will be located, stemming from the resources folder. By setting gfx/items/ as the value, I'm telling the game that it can find our sprites by going to resources/gfx/items. Let's create the folders in that path now so that we don't forget later. Resources, gfx, items. Make sure these are all lowercase. Now let's define the version attribute. Always set this to 1, as this is what the game expects it to be. We're done defining the attributes of the tag that will contain all of our items. Right now, it appears that our tag is extending forever, which will cause an error. Isaac will crash if it comes across an error while reading an XML file, so let's make sure to close the tag. Do this by using an open arrow bracket, a slash, the name of the tag we're trying to close, and a closed arrow bracket. This slash here tells the game that this is the end of the tag that was defined up here. After all of that, we now have a container for all of the items for our mod. The next step is to actually define an item. There are 4 types of items in Isaac: passives, actives, familiars, and trinkets. We want to make a passive item, so make a new tag with the name passive. Remember, to create a new tag, you use an open arrow bracket and then type the name. There are a bunch of different attributes that your item can have, and they're all documented in the documentation that I mentioned earlier. Our item is super simple, so we only need a few tags. I'm going to write the tags out, then explain what they do. I'm going to explain all of these tags in order and what they mean. This ID is only used by other XML files and will be changed to a different number when the game starts, so don't use it in your code. You can set the ID to whatever you want, as long as it's a number and that no other items in the mod has the same ID. Next is the name tag. This is quite self-explanatory. This is the name of your item. Now we have the GFX tag. GFX, which stands for graphical effects, is the sprite that the item will use. Something very important to know is that Isaac expects items to be in very specific directories. Because this item is a collectible, Isaac expects the file path to start from gfx root, which is resources, gfx, items. And then it also expects a folder in here called collectibles. And in here is where this gfx file path will start. And in this folder will be your sprite. Remember that all sprites in Isaac must have a bit depth of 32 and must be a PNG file. So make sure you set that in your art software. Here's a description, which is also self-explanatory. The quality level, which can be 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4. The only thing that quality really affects is tainted lost and what items can appear. But I recommend setting quality based on the power of the item. Certain mods, like external items descriptions, which is the most popular mod in all of Isaac, displays the quality level of items, so setting it to something reasonable will probably make people happy. Lastly is the cache tag. To cache something means to store it. The game keeps a cache of all of the player's stats so that it doesn't need to recalculate what they should be every single frame. The game needs to know what cache will be altering, and we tell it by using this attribute. You can change every single stat listed on screen right now, and can include multiple caches by adding a space between each. We only want to affect the player's damage, so I'm just going to type damage, and be done with it. Finally, we need to close the tag. Since this tag doesn't contain anything within it, we can simply close it by adding a slash at the end and then a closed arrow bracket. Our item will now exist in-game, but it won't show up anywhere since I didn't add it to any item pools. This involves a whole nother XML file, and for the sake of brevity, I'm not going to go over how to add to item pools. Once again, you can check how the game does it yourself or check the community documentation that I've linked in the description. Before we check it out in-game, make sure that you save. You can tell if a file has not been saved by this circle that replaces the X. You should save very frequently. All you need to do is press Ctrl+S. It is as simple as that, and it'll save you so much headache if your power goes out or something similar. It's always a good habit to save. Alright, let's go in-game and spawn an item pedestal with our item. We're going to spawn the item with the game's developer console. If you're not familiar with this, please check out the wiki page for it, which is linked in the description. Open up the developer console by pressing tilde. Remember that the game will set the ID of your item itself. So to find the ID through the console, let's first act like we're giving ourselves the item. So type G, which is short for give item. Then type the item's name. And as you can see, the item ID is 734. Now we're going to spawn the collectible on an item pedestal. Item pedestals are entities. An entity in Isaac is essentially anything you can find in the environment. This includes, but is not limited to, NPCs, particle effects, tiers, projectiles, and players. An item pedestal is also a type of entity. An entity's ID is composed of 3 different numbers separated by dots. Let's take the ID of our item on an item pedestal, for example. The first number is the entity type. So for example, a gaper is different from a spider. The second number is the variant. The variant dictates a different kind of the same entity type. So a dime versus a nickel, or a frowning gaper versus a flaming gaper. Lastly is a subtype, which is a different kind of an entity type and variant combination. For things like enemies, this can be the champion type. And for pickups, which are collectibles, it can be the specific item. To spawn an item pedestal with our item, we type the entity type for a pickup, subtype for a collectible, and the item ID as our variant. There it is! But picking it up doesn't give us any damage. This is because we need to define its behavior using code. Alright, this is the part of the video that's going to get confusing for beginners and new coders. I welcome you to pause and rewind as much as you need to, and I'll try to go slow when necessary. To start coding in Lua, create a file in your mods directory named main.lua. Since we're just making one item for our mod, I'm going to keep all of the code in this main.lua file. This is the file that your mod will run when it loads. Your mod won't automatically load other Lua files in your mod, so if you have any others, you'll need to load them yourself. Since we're only making one item, I'm going to keep all of the code in this main.lua file. But if your mod becomes more complicated, it's wise to split up your code into multiple files so that you can easily navigate and read it. I'll make a tutorial on how to structure your mod's directory at a different time. When programming anything, you're going to read your code much more often than you're going to write it. Make sure to structure your code in a readable format using variable names that are self-explanatory, and leave comments to explain parts of your code that are difficult to understand without context. The first thing you'll do in your main.lua file is to register it with the game. Register your mod and store the reference to it in a variable like so. The variable's name can be anything. The first parameter, also known as an argument, will be the name of your mod. This can be anything and won't show. This second parameter must always be equal to 1. The number 1 is required as a future-proofing measure in case they ever make a new version of the API. It'll tell your mod to use version 1 of the API, which is what we use now. To be realistic, they'll probably not make a version 2 of the API, but instead build on top of version 1. But regardless, this is required, so make sure you put a 1 as the second parameter. To interact with our item, we first need to get the item's ID. As I said earlier, the game will make the ID a number depending on the conditions your mod was loaded in. Conditions which you cannot control. I'm going to write out how you do this, and then I'm going to explain. Two important concepts to understand are classes and objects. Classes, in layman terms, are big tables with a bunch of functions. An object is something you can create with a constructor that returns something that is mutable, meaning it can change. Let's take our mod, for example. Register mod is a constructor, so it's creating an object which is known as a mod reference. Objects can have methods and properties that can change depending on how you use the object, unlike classes which typically are static, meaning they don't change. If you're confused, a method is the same as a function, with the difference being that a method is tied specifically to an object. If you're an experienced programmer, you'll know that this is all a lot more complex than that, and there's a lot more moving parts. But the intricacies of classes and objects are not important right now. If you'd like to learn more, just Google object-oriented programming and read an article on it. There's this one example about cars and trucks. You can check that out. Classes and objects, at their core, are just fancy dictionaries. Unlike arrays, which are ordered and only indexed by numbers starting from 1, dictionaries are unordered and can have anything as the index. Remember that arrays and dictionaries are both still tables. To access or set a value in a dictionary, you just type the dictionary, a dot, then the name of the index that holds the value you want to obtain. So for example, foo equals 23, and this will set the value foo in our example dictionary to 23. The function here that we're using is a part of the Isaac class. Since Isaac is a class and not an object, we type its name, a dot, then the function's name, which is getItemID by name. And then we call that function with this here. The only parameter that this function takes is the name of the item as defined in our XML file. To change the stats of a player when they have our item, we want to make a callback. A callback is a function that is run by the game when a certain event takes place, i.e. an entity takes damage or the player's cache is reevaluated. Our callback will be provided different arguments depending on the event we're listening for, but the first argument will always be the mod reference. It'll always be the mod reference because the game assumes that the callback you're providing is a method of an object. And methods are always provided the object that they're a part of. It's just that it's hidden unless you call the special keyword self, which you don't need to worry about right now. We can either make this method a part of our mod reference object, like this, or we can make it a part of our own object, like this. There are no downsides to either way of doing this, and I personally prefer to make my own object to keep things in a manner I find more organized. For the sake of simplicity, we're going to be using the mod object as a container for our callbacks. We're going to be hooking into the event MC_evaluate_cache. This event runs every time the cache is reevaluated by the game. It provides two arguments to our callback: the player that is having a cache reevaluated, and the flag corresponding to the specific cache. A flag is a binary number which represents a value. We made our item only affect the damage flag, so we should check to see if the cache being evaluated is the damage cache. First, make sure to get our arguments as such. Now, to get the value of the damage cache flag, we need to index the enumeration cache flag. An enumeration, often called an enum for short, or an enum, is basically just a dictionary of simple, easily understandable names for specific values. The actual value for the damage cache flag is 1, but if you're reading the code, you won't realize what 1 means without unnecessary effort of looking it up. To keep things readable, we'll use an enum and index that enum. The name of the enum is cache flag, and we can get the damage cache flag like this. Remember, flags are not just ordinary numbers, they're numbers in binary. This means you can store multiple flags in a single number, but also means you must use bitwise operations to check if your flag is in that number. That word may sound complicated to you, so just remember that when you're checking for a specific flag, let's say in an if statement, you type the number you're looking at, an ampersand or an and symbol, the flag that you're looking at, and then checking if that is equal to the aforementioned flag. This conditional statement will return true if cache damage is in this number. Now you can actually change the player's stats. You should only change a player's stats in a callback hooked into MC evaluate cache, else there'll be issues. We could just add 1 to the player's damage, but then it won't give them a damage up for every copy of the item that they have. Let's say with Diplopia. To remedy this, we can multiply the damage up by the number of the item that they have, and then add that to their damage. Get the amount of the item that they have as such, using the collectible number method of the player object that is provided as the first argument of evaluate cache, and put in the item's ID that we defined up here. Next, multiply the amount of the item by the amount of damage you want your item to give. I've defined a variable up here corresponding to the amount of damage I want to give per item. The reason why I don't just type 1 and instead make a variable is because we want to avoid magic numbers in our code. A magic number is a number that is placed without any context, so it's not immediately evident what it means. There's more information about magic numbers online, so just Google that if you're interested. There's a good Wikipedia article on it. Finally, add the damage to add to their damage stat by setting their damage stat to player.damage plus the amount of damage to add. Alright, we're almost done here. The last thing we need to do is actually hook the callback into the MC evaluate cache event. We do this by using the add callback method of the mod reference object, which we got up here. The first parameter is the event that we want to hook into, and the second is the callback. We get the callback that we want by accessing the MC evaluate cache enumerator, which is part of the mod callbacks global, a global being a variable that you can access from anywhere. This second parameter is the callback that we're hooking into the event. Make sure that when you're providing the callback, you use a dot instead of a colon to reference it. And you don't add any parentheses at the end. If you don't use a dot to reference it, Lua will assume you're trying to call the function and it won't work. Alright, let's save our file. And now, for the moment of truth, let's go in game and test if our mod works. You can quickly reload your mod's code by typing in Lua mod followed by the mod's folder's name. So I'm going to type my mod. If it says success, then that means there are no errors. If there was an error in your code, it'll appear in red text. The error that displays if something in your code went wrong usually has a lot of information, like the line that was the cause and the exact reason that the error happened. Make sure to take a lot of time to read the error to decipher what went wrong in your mod. Now, we're going to pick up multiple copies of the item to make sure that everything worked correctly. Use the up arrow to cycle back to a previously used command, or use the down arrow if you accidentally go past it, and then press enter. Alright, there are 2 items. Let's pick them up. It works! Congratulations, you've created your first passive item and now know how to make and use callbacks. Follow the link to the documentation on all the different events below. I'd like to remind you, before I wrap up, that this mod is available for download in the description by following the GitHub link and clicking on the episode 2 folder. If anything went wrong, you can cross-reference your code with mine. Just make sure you learn what went wrong and try not to do it next time. Thank you so much for watching, and please join the Modding of Isaac Discord server if you need any help with a complicated question. I'll try my best to answer questions in the comments, but if it's something more hands-on, then I'll tell you to join that server. In the next episode, we'll be making our first active item. Alright, see ya! Look, how long was that? An hour. Gee, oh, it's gonna be a pain to edit. Oh my god, it's an hour-long recording. It's gonna be so long to edit.